Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. I've wanted to do this for a long time. Mini versus returns, and one hell of a matchup. Revived, refreshed, and redesigned, we re-engage with Rolex and Oris. This is a rematch of a previous bout. Both Rolex Submariner and Oris Aquis redesigned, re-engined, and for the 2021 model year, everything is new. So we are wiping the slate clean. We are going to compare the Rolex Submariner date to the Oris Aquis date. Let the games begin. Versus starts now. All right, zoom out a little bit. Let's get started with the watch of the moment. Ever since it debuted, the 2020 Rolex Submariner was a timepiece that couldn't possibly meet the expectations forged in the years between 2008, when the model was last renewed, and 2020, at which point it became something of an elder statesman in the Rolex catalog, yes, but also just old, as the 3135 movement was ancient, and the watch itself was badly in need of at least a refinement. Well, 126610LN answers our prayers. The watch is new, both inside and out. Let's take a look at it on the wrist. Now, big change. It is now a 41mm watch, though as I measure it, no single dimension is more than 0.7 millimeters larger than the previous 40mm Rolex Submariner. Some of the dimensions are actually identical. You can see it's a 41mm watch on my 16cm circumference wrist, but in terms of profile, it's still 12.4 millimeters thick. That hasn't changed. Lug to lug, it is 48.2 millimeters. If you include the solid end links, then it is 51.1 millimeters as I measure it with my carbon fiber calibers. New, you have a 21 millimeter spacing between the lugs, so that's changed. And really, the major change is going to be aesthetic. Because the end link of the bracelet has expanded and the lugs have been thinned out somewhat, they now come to more of a point. They're not quite as squared off and blockish as the first generation super case, so there is greater elegance here, even if it isn't quite a return to the hand-finished bevels of Submariner yore. Taking one last quick look, I can recommend this watch for a wrist as small as 13.5 to 14 centimeters circumference. Taking a look at the bracelet, it is the Rolex Oyster bracelet. Not a whole lot changes here. Obviously, the spacing of the end link is broader. Satination, polished flanks, and of course, an Oyster clasp with a double lock. You've got a beak and a hook internally. That's a lift lock system. You can see that latch. And then there's a clamshell externally. You can see polished flanks to the clasp, but it's utilitarian. It's satin finished on its top. Unlock inside, it's polished. This is not an entry-level watch. You can see the Glidelock system returns. 10 increments of adjustment, 2 millimeters each, 20 millimeters total. It's not really an all-or-nothing fold-out extension dive watch style. Instead, it's a little bit more subtle. It can be used for all-or-nothing extension over a wet or a dry suit, but it can also be used for sizing, giving it a degree of utility you don't get in a standard dive extension. Of course, there is a half link built in, so between Glidelock, removable full-size links, and that half link, you have quite a bit of sizing flexibility. Rolex still using a 904L steel. Its main advantage is that it is more corrosion resistant than 316. So while there's not a large practical difference, the watch is a bit more resilient, for example, against salt water, and it doesn't need to be rinsed after salt exposure. Rolex is making its cases, its bracelets, and its clasps, as well as its dials, its movements, and in this generation of the sub, even its shock protection. So you're getting an all Rolex watch. You have a 120 click bezel. Let's hear the sound. Very refined. Possibly the most refined. Exceptionally few dive bezels compared to what Rolex has achieved. I think it's Rolex Grand Seiko, and that's pretty much it. Now, you easily align that sapphire capped pearl with the minute hand. You have a 0 to 60 minute count up timer, ceramic insert with platinum fill for the characters so they won't tarnish or oxidize over time, dial, black lacquer, white gold hands, white gold indices, and you can see one of the changes now with the Submariner now featuring that little crown between Swiss and Made. You know, it's a modern generation Rolex triplock crown, 300-meter water resistance inside the case, Rolex Calibre 3235. Bidirectional rotating it as ever, but now with a rotor bearing for greater shock resistance than the old jeweled staff. Chronergy escapement, Leica etched, or I should say Leica lithography formed. It's an additive rather than reductive process. 70 hours of power reserve rather than 48. Stop seconds, quick set date, full balance bridge with a free sprung index for shock resistance, 31 joules, 8 beats per second, anti-magnetic niobium zirconium blue oxidized hairspring. Rolex calls that Cerachrom blue, and Rolex takes the movement, already COSC certified, cases it up, and guarantees that the watch you receive will run no worse than -2 + 2 seconds per day. It is very accurate, it is very tough, and of course, it is classically styled. Let's discuss the Oris. The Oris Aquis Date, all new for 2021. You're getting a 43.5 millimeter watch, but as with the Rolex, it doesn't quite wear the way the headline size would suggest. On the wrist, they are physically identical. And the Rolex is 51.1 millimeters lug to lug, but the Oris is actually 50 millimeters lug to lug. I should mention it's the end link to end link distance with the bracelet that extends the Rolex to 51.1, but you can see how the end links of this bracelet pivot straight down. So this winds up being, by a small margin, the thinner watch across the wrist. Now, it is 43.5, but at 13.3 millimeters thick, it is thicker than the Rolex, but not so much that you notice it. Throwing the watch on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, you can see it would fit underneath a dress cuff too. There's no problem there. It's a big watch, but it's not a huge watch, and in practice, the watches look and feel the same size on the wrist. Taking a quick look at this timepiece, you can see from overhead, it actually looks narrower across the wrist. And when viewed down the barrel, you can see how that bracelet pulls straight down around my wrist. Real good fit. Same recommendation. Don't go smaller than 13.5 centimeters circumference wrist size when wearing this watch, but I still find that a broad range of wrists, including female wrists, will wear this quite well. Taking a quick look at the bracelet, you can see they went with a 3-link design. Thankfully, it's not duplicative of Rolex, and it's a little bit of an unusual combination because you have the polished outer links and then the satin centers. You can also see that there is some taper to this bracelet, as there is with the Rolex, and that taper is an elegant and much appreciated detail. Cheap bracelets tend to have zero taper. Uncommon, you can see that a bar and a screw is used, at least at face value, for fixing this bracelet to the case, but we'll talk about this in a moment. There's actually a quick release system that works underneath, and you can quickly release the bracelet from the case, and if you get the watch on the bracelet, it actually comes with an accessory strap. So this is a quick release system. It comes with a strap. The strap has the same attachment method, and it allows you to quickly and easily denude the watch of its bracelet, and then snap it shut just the same way. Now, looking at the bracelet flank, you might first think that with a retail price of $3,500 versus $9,150 for the sub, it must have pins and sleeves fixing the removable links. But in fact, we actually have screws fixing the removable links in place, which means that this is still built the upscale way, and frankly, better than a modern Patek bracelet. Taking a look at the extension, it is a fold-out extension, so you don't get that incremental adjustment that you get in the sub. But again, for $3,500, you're getting a high-quality bracelet, a high-quality extension, and 3 different divots that allow you to change the anchoring point of the bracelet in the clasp. You're also not getting a cheap clamshell like you do on so many Breitlings that cost thousands more. You've got a combination of satin and polish on this clasp, and then a twin-trigger release system with a fairly beefy, milled internal single swing arm. So having that twin-trigger release, you have a little bit of peace of mind that this is not a friction-fit clasp, and it doesn't have a stamped and cheap piece of tinfoil locking it shut. The case is, if nothing else, refreshingly different. As the lugs are dramatically broken out from the case band, you can see the case is mostly of satin finish. Unusually, it has a sort of conical tilt, thinning out as it approaches the bezel. The lugs themselves are satinated on their sides, polished on their hoods, and then there's a little hairline polished streak underneath the bezel. The bezel has a polished outer face and a rather sharp knurling. It has a different feel and sound than the Rolex. Let's have a listen. It's chunkier, more mechanical. Now, it's still 120 clicks, so you can locate it with the same degree of precision if you are using it for timing purposes. And I always prefer a dive bezel for timing on the surface, even over a chronograph. They're just easier to read. The insert here is also ceramic, so it's giving up nothing to Rolex in that regard. It's got the same scratch resistance and a dial of uncommon beauty. It has a lovely Moser-style fumé fade from almost iridescent blue at the center to navy blue, almost black at the edge. You'll note that the indices themselves are rhodium-plated applique steel, so this is not a printed dial in spite of the sub $4,000 price point. The date is located down at 6 o'clock, so at least aesthetically it's a little bit different, but one advantage is that there is no Cyclops eye. You have screw-fixed removable and replaceable crown guards, which is nice in case they do get gnashed. Here we also have 300-meter water resistance and, significantly, an all-new movement. Now, in addition to the quick-release bracelet system, we have a new caliber here, and while the display case back is not new, it's an advantage in that the movement is actually worth seeing. Note that the caliber 400 is properly sized for the case. Automatic winding, it has twin mainspring barrels, 25 jewel, or I should say it is a 21 joule movement with 5 position adjustment, which is the chronometer standard, and it's guaranteed to run no worse than -3 plus 5 seconds a day from the factory. So the 5-day power reserve combines with hacking seconds and a quick set date, as well as a 10-year warranty, making this a truly imposing proposition for $3,500. I'm genuinely impressed by what you get with this watch. Also, it has a silicone escapement, which means it has an unlubricated escapement interface, which helps the watch to go a decade between services. Really, you can't ask a whole lot more for a manufacturer movement in a sports-style watch for under $4,000. So let's talk about the advantages here, and then I'm going to pick a winner. Okay, Rolex Submariner 2020 model, 126610 Lunette Noire. It is, without a doubt, the one to buy new. This is a watch you can buy for $9,150, provided you get on a wait list and then you bide your time. But when the time comes, you could wear this watch for a year and then resell it for between $13,000 and $15,000. So if you're on the wait list, no reason to get off. You can own this watch basically for free and even pocket a little bit of money. Okay, status. It is not my thing. It's not why I buy a watch, but it is the reason many people buy a Rolex. If you want the utmost in brand equity and status, they say buy a Richard Mille, buy a Rolex, or a Patek Philippe. Of that list, only one of those watches isn't going to cost more than a kidney, and this is the one. So in terms of what it conveys on the basis of accomplishment, circumstance, and pomp, this is your watch if you're the fashionista who must be seen with a status symbol. Now, I'm also going to say that baseline precision here is higher. First, because rather than simply promising a precision, Rolex goes out and gets the COSC certificate for the movement. It then recertifies the movement in-house as a cased-up watch to run no worse than -2 plus 2 per 24 hours. The Oris is good, promising -3 plus 5, but +2 -2, and backed with a warranty is put up or shut up, and the Rolex has better baseline precision assured from the factory. Thinner. Take a quick look at them, sapphire to sapphire. You can see neither one of these is thick for a dive watch, but at 12.4 millimeters thick, the Rolex is thinner, and there's just no arguing with that. Also, the watch is a better match for dress attire, as there's more of a formality about a Submariner than there is about any Aquis model. There's more of an understatement, a thinner profile, better cuff compatibility, and it's generally considered a standard for the watch you can wear with anything, whereas, especially in its more colorful iterations, the Oris is perhaps a little bit goofier. Now, bezel, feel, and sound. They're both 120 click, but this one feels and sounds superb. It's the feel and the sound of money, and Rolex invested it here. Now, history and heritage. The Aquis has been around since the 2010s, and it's much loved. This watch, however, was there at the dawn of the species with the Blancpain 50 Fathoms back in 1953. So in terms of real history, yes, Rolex is obnoxious with its event sponsorship and its ambassadors, its marketing dollars, and the ubiquity of its ads, but the reality is what they're advertising does have some truth to it. The Rolex was not just one of the originals and one of the founders of the dive watch space, but there is a history, a heritage, and an integrity to this watch that explains why from generation to generation, it still looks like a Rolex Submariner. And the owner of a Rolex 6200 back in the early 1950s would have looked at this and said, yeah, I recognize that as a Rolex Submariner. And I guarantee you that in the 2050s and 60s, they will look at this watch and say, that's a Rolex Submariner. I strongly doubt there will still be an Oris Aquis that looks like this in 10, 20, 30 years. So never planned obsolescence at Rolex. Also, I would say that in terms of exclusivity, Rolex is going to keep the supply of these dear. Oris is going to sell as many of these as it can pass through gates. Now, let's talk about better bracelet quality. It feels better. When you rattle it, it sounds more solid. Obviously, for thousands more, you should get a bracelet, but I just want to confirm that you do, in fact. You get this double locking clasp that's finished inside and out, and the Glidelock system, which is incrementally adjustable, gives you more flexibility as well as more overall extension than the fold-out in the Oris's clasp, which, while excellent for its price, does feel cheaper than this, as it should. Finally, I'm going to say that this likely has better anti-magnetic qualities. While the Oris exceeds the ISO 764 4800 ampere per meter, this watch has a niobium zirconium hairspring, and that's the same material used on the 500,000 ampere per meter IWC Ingenieur of the late 80s and early 90s. So if I had to put money on it, I would say this watch is probably more anti-magnetic. Also, with a winding rotor bearing, a full balance bridge, and a free sprung index, I'm going to name this watch as probably tougher physically and more shock resistant. Now, advantages for the Oris Aquis Date. Let's talk about them. This is a watch you can buy for $3,300 on the strap, or if you want to buy it on the bracelet and get the strap included as an accessory, $3,500 for the watch as you see here. Now, that's probably going to become $3,000, maybe even $2,800, $2,900 as a used watch. So not only is this watch easier to purchase, but it's easily the one to buy used of the two, as the Rolex is going to be worth more. This is probably going to be worth less, and that's to your advantage as a dive watch customer. Power reserve. Here you get twin mainspring barrels and 5 days of power reserve. Here you get 70 hours, so 3 days versus 5 days. Advantage Oris Aquis. Also, the fact that it is a 2-barrel movement means that there's probably going to be less drop-off in amplitude from day to day as the power reserve exhausts itself compared to a single-barrel movement like the Rolex. So this is probably going to see, in addition to less power reserve, more amplitude fluctuation, which changes the timing properties of the watch, whereas with twin barrels and 2-phased springs, you're probably going to see less amplitude drop-off over, day 1, day 2, day 3, especially on this watch. I'll also mention warranty. 10 years, 5 years. Rolex has helped to establish 5 years as the industry standard, but in a world where Oris can give you 10, that should be the standard. So advantage Oris, 10-year warranty. The bracelet, I have to say, I love the quick release system. This is brilliant. There doesn't seem to be any reason why Oris can do this, and yet for $9,100, for some reason, Rolex can't. This is just a brilliant system. And the fact that the clasp itself is on the bracelet means that you can just fit conventional Oris straps if you want to, even if you don't have the quick release one. But this is a wonderful feature that, frankly, every watch priced in the thousands of dollars should sooner rather than later adopt. Also, let's talk about the display caseback. You've purchased this new Calibre 400. Now you get to see it. Even better, it's properly sized for the case. Well, Rolex gives you an in-house Calibre 2 and the same amount of water resistance, so there's no advantage there, but you get a solid case back that doesn't show you that for which you've paid. So on that basis, advantage Oris Aquis, you get to see the movement. Want another advantage? Well, I can tell that that's the 6th right there, because I put it at the 6th numeral, and I can tell that that's a 3 because I put it at the 3 o'clock station on the dial. But do you see how these are equally visible? This is a bit of a wart or a tumor on the dial. I've never liked the Cyclops eye. This proves that you can still read your date without an external magnifier. So on that basis, advantage Aquis. It is more cheerful, I should say. It cheers me up. The Rolex, well, you can add color. You can go white gold and get a blue bezel, or you can go Kermit and get a green bezel, or go with some sort of colored gold case, but you're going to pay to do so. This thing is maybe a little bit too sober to be truly fun, whereas this thing reflects the exuberance that I think we all imagine in the idealized luxury watch. So this is subjective. It's my opinion, but I think this is a more cheerful and upbeat watch. Okay, no Rolex brand baggage. No one's going to ask you, is that a real Oris? No one's going to come up to you at a restaurant and demand to know whether the watch is authentic or how much it cost. People who notice this watch are either going to be watch guys or simply responding to the fact that it is upbeat, fun, and yes, as I said, a cheery watch that lifts your spirits. This, unfortunately, for better or for worse, has become a status symbol. And while I mentioned that's one of the strengths of the watch, I should also mention it's a double-edged sword that can work against you in awkward and uncomfortable ways with business associates, friends, and, of course, strangers. So no Rolex brand baggage here, and although you're going to see in a moment that they're very closely matched in lume, I'm going to give it to the Oris, which has larger loomed plots on its indices as well as its hands. So which of these two watches do I want? The watch that helped to bring me to the luxury watch hobby in the late 1990s, or the watch that I think represents, on so many levels, a more desirable piece than the latest version of the Submariner? I'm going to say that if it were my money, not getting the watch to sell it and buy something else, but if it were my money, I had to buy the watch and keep the watch, I would have absolutely no qualms about paying my $3,500, heck, probably discounted 10 to 15%, but I would pay my $3,500 for the Oris Aquis Date. In my opinion, it's just a better watch for the money, and given how fey some of the advantages of the Submariner are in bracelet and clasp and bezel, I really have to say overall, it feels like this is no sacrifice at all. The best dive watch for the money in 2021 with the best warranty bar none, and the Oris Aquis Date is my choice. Guys, let me know in the description below, If you were just to get one of these to keep, not to buy and to sell, but to keep and own, which one would you prefer to own and which one is your winner? Time out, Tim out, and thanks for logging on. Okay, we're back with our two heroes, Lume Shots. They're equally bright, equally blue, but with bigger plots and bigger hands, I just find it a bit easier to read the Oris Aquis. It wins again.